Welcome to Phantom Fables. Tonight, we take a trip deep into the heart of a forest full of secrets and past ashes. This is the chilling tale of Ashes in the Dark. Winter had laid a bleak silence on the village of Nógrád, Hungary, in 1736. Snow pressed upon the rooftops, and the sharp frost bit into the air. But it wasn't just the cold that chilled the people of this village. A whisper had started about an ancient deathly curse buried but not forgotten, like embers from a fire which died long ago. On the outskirts of the village, at the edge of the thick woods called the Black Grove, stood a tumble-down house. The house belonged to Othniel and his younger sister Aviva, the last remnants of the Levi family, a lineage rumored to have ties with the darkest secrets of the village. Since their father, Obed, died under mysterious circumstances, the house seemed to groan under the weight of its own history. People in the village kept away from the siblings Levi. The fact that they were Jews and the proximity to the abandoned graveyard added fuel to the rumors. Children dare each other to run past the house after sunset, and more superstitious grown-ups whispered that the shadows near the windows stayed too long, watching. Aviva, barely 20, had learned to steel herself against the staring and talking. She occupied her days, tending to what little could be put right in their humble home with their meager resources. Othniel, her elder brother, had become quieter since their father's passing away. He spent most of his day in the forest, cutting down wood to sell in the market square, his shoulders weighed down by responsibility and guilt. It was a bitterly cold evening when the first sign of something out of the ordinary occurred. The sun had set hours before, casting the world into the pale, silvery glow of a crescent moon. Aviva sat close to the fireplace, sewing patches on Othniel's worn coat, when a knock shattered the quiet. Othniel sharpened an old hunting knife, frozen in mid-movement. "Who could that be at such an hour?" he muttered. He got up carefully and approached the door. Aviva remained seated, her sewing needle clutched like a weapon. When Othniel opened the door, a cold blast of wind swept in, heavy with the acrid scent of burned wood. Upon their threshold stood Eliam, elder of the village. His face, grooved by weather and years, was taut with press of purpose. His breath misted in the cold. "You have to come with me," Eliam said, his voice devoid of any pleadings. "Why?" Othniel asked, his grasp on the knife tightening. "There is no time to explain. It's about the graveyard." The word graveyard sent a shiver down Aviva's spine. Their father had spoken of that place, with malice, on his dying bed. "Stay away from the ashes," he had whispered in a frail and broken voice. At the time, they had looked upon it as incoherent babbling from a dying man. Othniel rose unwillingly, drawing his coat over his shoulders, and indicated to Aviva to stay inside. "I'll go. You stay here." "No," Aviva said firmly, rising to her feet. "If this is about the graveyard, I'm coming with you." Eliam's expression darkened, but he didn't argue. Together, the three of them made their way through the snow-covered village, their breaths puffing into the cold night air. The streets were deserted, the windows of the houses dark. The graveyard lay on the outskirts of the village, a sprawl of field with crooked headstones and crumbling mausoleums. As they drew closer, a strange unease settled over Aviva. It seemed the air was heavier, the cold sharper. "This is madness," Othniel muttered, but he kept walking. Eliam led them to an old mausoleum near the center of the graveyard. The structure was ancient, its stone walls blackened with age. The door had been forced open, the heavy iron hinges twisted and broken. "Who did this?" Othniel asked, his voice low. Eliam didn't answer. Instead, he stepped inside, motioning for them to follow. Inside, the mausoleum was colder than the night air outside. There were carvings in some language Aviva didn't understand, faded across the walls. Set into the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and upon that sat a tarnished lantern. "What is this?" Aviva asked, stepping closer. "This lantern," Eliam whispered, his voice barely audible, "is older than this village, older than the forest. It should never have been disturbed." "Who disturbed it?" Othniel asked. Eliam hesitated. "We don't know. But since the lantern was uncovered, strange things have been happening. Fires starting without cause, shadows moving where there should be none. And then..." He paused, his face pale. "Then there's the ash." "What ash?" Aviva asked. Eliam pointed to the ground. First it seemed like dirt, but as Aviva hunched down to look closer, she realized it was ash-fine, gray, and faintly warm to the touch. The moment her fingers made contact with it, a strange sensation flooded her. She felt as though she were being watched, as though unseen eyes were boring into her. She jerked her hand back, her heart pounding. "We should go," Othniel said, tense. "Now." But even as they had thus turned to leave, there was a heavy door of the mausoleum that slammed shut with a deafening crash. It was a sound that seemed to carry its echo across the chamber and to shake the very walls. Aviva's breathing caught in her throat. What was that? But before Eliam could answer her, a guttural whisper, low, seemed to resound throughout and out of the shadows themselves. "The lantern needs to go back," the voice raspily said. With each utterance, much venom was spewed. Aviva and Othniel exchanged a horrified look. "Returned where?" he asked, trying to keep a quiver from his voice. "To the ashes." At this, the lantern started glowing, very dim and like a flame dying out, its light quivering. Then ash on the ground began to rise as if blown up into the air. Eliam fell to his knees, mumbling some incoherent prayer. "We should never have come here," he whispered. "We have awakened it." "What is it?" Aviva asked. The edge of panic laced her tone. Eliam looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "Something that should have stayed buried." Since that night in the graveyard, a choking silence had filled the village of Nógrád. An icy wind howled down the streets, making the loose shutters rattle and the bare branches of the black grove bend. Snow fell incessantly, but then it seemed to carry nothing of purity or peace, more akin to a shroud, clinging cold and unyielding dread over the village. For Aviva and Othniel, the events of the mausoleum haunted their every waking moment. The whispers, the ash, the strange glow of the lantern. All had combined to shake them to their very cores. Yet what really scared them was the unmistakable feeling that something had followed them home. In the days following their return, small, inexplicable things began to happen around their house. It was subtle at first, a cup falling off a table with no one near it, the sound of faint footsteps in the hall at night, and that uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Othniel was more paranoid than the others. "We went through a very bad experience, and it's playing tricks with our brains," he said to her one morning as he was chopping wood in the backyard. Aviva was not so convinced. "It's not in my head," she replied, voice quivering. "I feel it, Othniel. Something is here with us." That night, when Aviva came to light the fireplace, she saw there was a faint smear of ash upon the mantel. She wiped it clean, thought nothing more about it, but the next morning, the ash was there again, more of it this time, in a pattern that almost seemed to resemble a handprint. The lantern, which Eliam had insisted they take with them, now sat in their small storage room. Othniel had wanted to leave it behind, but Eliam had warned them against it. "You can't leave it there," he had said. "The lantern is tied to whatever curse has been unleashed. If it falls into the wrong hands, the village could suffer for it." So the lantern remained, hidden but far from forgotten. One night, Aviva woke to a faint light coming from under her door. Her heart pounded as she crept out of bed and opened the door to find the hallway bathed in an eerie, flickering glow. The light was emanating from the storage room. "Othniel," she whispered, shaking her brother awake. "What is it?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "The lantern," she said. "It's glowing." He followed her into the storage room very reluctantly. As they opened the creaking door, the lantern up on the shelf shone in a soft glow. The air in this room was heavy, almost not breathable, and there was a soft hum, almost seemingly from the lantern itself. "We need to destroy it," Aviva said, firm. Othniel shook his head. "We don't know what destroying it will do. Eliam said it's dangerous to tamper with it." "Keeping it is dangerous too," Aviva snapped. Before they could argue further, the hum grew louder. The glow intensified, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Then, without warning, the lantern went dark, plunging the room into silence and darkness. The next morning, they decided to confront Eliam. They found him at his home, a small cottage on the edge of the village. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he invited them inside. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" he said before they could speak. Aviva nodded. "The lantern, it's doing something, and there's something else, something in the house." Eliam sighed heavily. "I was afraid of this." He invited them to sit, and after, began speaking. "The lantern is not simply an accursed thing. It is a prison," he told you. "A mighty sorcerer once used it to entomb a malignant soul. The soul was too strong to annihilate, so the sorcerer bound it within the lantern and then buried it within the crypt. For centuries, the lantern lay undisturbed. But now," his eyes clouding with fear, he trailed off. "Now it's awake," Othniel finished grimly. Eliam nodded. "And it's trying to free itself. The ash, it's a sign of its growing strength. If the lantern is broken, the spirit will be unleashed, and its wrath will be unimaginable." Outside the house of Eliam, the siblings were even more disturbed than they had been before. They thought the lantern itself was the cause of all the problems, but now they were beginning to think it was just the tip of the iceberg. That night, the shadows in their house seemed darker, deeper. Aviva swore she saw them move out of the corner of her eye. Othniel tried to comfort her, but even he couldn't deny the strange occurrences anymore. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, barely audible, but as night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. They came from every corner of the house, overlapping in a cacophony of voices, speaking some language neither knew. Aviva clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop!" she cried. Othniel grabbed the lantern and, in a rage, flung himself out into the night, yelling, "What do you want from us?" The whispers stopped. The silence after that was deafening. Then, from the darkness, a single voice replied, "Return me to the ashes." The next morning, in desperation, they went back to Eliam. "The spirit wants to go back to the mausoleum," Aviva said. Eliam shook his head. "It's a trick. If you return the lantern to the ashes, it breaks the sorcerer's binding spell. The spirit will be free to roam." "Then what are we to do?" Othniel demanded. "There's only one way to stop it," said Eliam. "You have to find the original incantation used in the binding of the spirit and its strengthening. But the incantation is lost, buried with the remains of the sorcerer deep in the Black Grove. The Black Grove was a place of fear and legend. Nobody even dared enter into its depth, not even in daytime. But if we don't find it?" Aviva asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eliam's face was grim. "Then the spirit will grow stronger until it can break free on its own. And when it does, it will consume everything in its path." They had no other choice, hence, the siblings got ready to head into the Black Grove. With nothing but a map Eliam had provided and their resolution, they left at dawn. The forest was unforgiving. just as the story said. The treetops were high above, blocking out the sun with their gnarled branches, while the air reeked of rot, the only sound the crunch of snow underfoot. The deeper they went, the heavier with foreboding it became. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, and the whispers started again, louder, more urgent. At last, a clearing fell open before them. A weathered stone altar stood at its middle, half smothered in snow, strange symbols carved into its face, just like those in the mausoleum. "This must be it," said Aviva in a shaking voice. But as they drew closer to the altar, the earth beneath them started to shudder. The air grew cold, and the whispers burst into a deafening roar. An uncanny silence bathed the clearing in the heart of the Black Grove. It was as if the wind, which had been howling with the twisting of the trees, had held its breath and left the oppressive silence to take its place. Before the ancient altar, which had runes etched into its surface too old to decipher and slick with frost, Othniel and Aviva stood. "This is where it all ends," Aviva whispered, drawing her coat closer around her in the chill of the morning. "Or where it begins," Othniel muttered, placing his hand on the lantern. The cursed thing lay heavy in his hand, its faint glow pulsing like a heartbeat. As if to punctuate their presence, the earth beneath the altar began to shudder. Snow slid from its edges, revealing more runes and faint symbols that shimmered with an otherworldly light. The siblings exchanged a look, fear and resolution mirrored in their eyes. The air grew thick, pressing down upon them like some invisible weight. Shadows slithered along the edges of the clearing, coalescing into forms that were almost human but distorted, their limbs too long, faces devoid of features. "Do you see them?" Aviva's voice was shaking. "Yes," Othniel said through gritted teeth. "They're watching us." The whispers were back now, louder it seemed, and overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to be echoing both around and inside them. Words in a long-forgotten tongue filled the clearing, echoing off the symbols on the altar. "What do we do?" Aviva asked, the slightest rise of panic edging into her voice. "We find the incantation," Othniel said, firm, pulling out the parchment Eliam had given them. The map had led them here, but its instructions on what to do next were vague at best. As Othniel spread the parchment over the altar, the glow of the lantern flared brighter. The light danced across the symbols, illuminating patterns that hadn't been visible before. "Look!" Aviva pointed to a symbol, a spiral with jagged lines surrounding it. "It is the binding sigil," Othniel realized. "It matches the one on the lantern." Scarcely had they thus spoken when the earth right beneath the altar burst asunder with a loud crack. A blast of icy air welled upwards, heavy with the unmistakable stench of decay. Up from the fissure arose a figure of dark smoke that seemed to shift and writhe like tendrils of fog. The whispers coalesced into one voice, low and rumbling. "Who dares disturb my slumber?" Aviva stumbled backward, her heart racing. What is that?" "The spirit," Othniel said, his voice barely audible above a whisper. He stepped forward, holding the lantern aloft. Its light seemed to enrage the thing, which recoiled for a brief moment before surging forward, looming over them. "You carry my prison," the spirit hissed. "Release me, and I will grant you mercy." "Don't listen to it," Aviva cried, clutching at Othniel's arm. But the voice of the spirit was seductive, dripping with promises of power and freedom. "You cannot contain me forever," it said. "The longer I am bound, the stronger I become." Othniel turned back to the parchment, wrenching his eyes from the spirit. Somewhere in those symbols was hidden the binding incantation, a riddle to be solved. Aviva leaned over him now, her hands shaking a little as she outlined the lines with her fingers. "Here," she whispered, touching a series of symbols that circled the binding sigil. "This must be part of it." The lantern in Othniel's hand started to vibrate, its light pulsating at irregular intervals. The spirit shrieked and screamed with their ears, and a cold wave running over their bodies. "Read it aloud!" Othniel shouted, pushing the parchment to Aviva. Aviva hesitated as strange symbols floated before her eyes. "I do not even know how to pronounce these." "Just try." Aviva took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice shaking as she attempted to mimic the unfamiliar sounds. The symbols on the altar began to glow, their light growing stronger with each word. The spirit howled, its form twisting and expanding. The shadows in the clearing surged forward, closing off any possibility of escape around the siblings. "You dare defy me!" the spirit roared. "You will suffer for your insolence!" The earth beneath them started to crack and splinter, skeletal hands clawing their way from the earth as the spirits of the dead, which were for centuries bound to the lantern, rose to do the bidding of the entity. Othniel swung the lantern in an arc, its light repelling the advancing figures. "Keep reading," he shouted. Aviva's voice rose louder and louder as she continued her incantation, the glyphs on the altar flaring bright. The spirit writhed, its form starting to break apart and disappear. As her incantation reached its climax, the glow of the lantern went blinding. The spirit let out a final deafening shriek as its form was sucked into the light. The shadows and skeletal figures disintegrated, leaving only the two siblings and the altar. The lantern exploded in a surge of energy that sent them both to the ground. When the light went out, the clearing was quiet again. The slit in the earth had sealed itself, and the symbols on the altar were muted and dead. "It's over," Othniel whispered hoarsely. Aviva nodded, streaming with tears. "We did it." The journey back to the village was long and harrowing, but they were alive. The villagers, who watched the siblings leave with fear and skepticism, greeted their return with cautious relief. Eliam met them at the edge of the village, a look between awe and gratitude upon his face. "You have succeeded where no one else could," he said. "The spirit is gone, and the curse is broken." But they knew better. The spirit wasn't truly gone. It was contained, its power curtailed, but not destroyed. The fragments of the lantern lay scattered, but the spell of binding remained intact. As they faced their house, Aviva turned to Othniel and asked, "Do you ever think it will return?" Othniel's gaze was far away as he replied, "If it does, we'll be ready." The story of the lantern and the spirit became a village legend, going from generation to generation in Nógrád. The siblings had lived their life in quiet vigilance, always being conscious of the lurking darkness which had once haunted their home. And deep within the shadows of the Black Grove, the altar waited, its symbols faint but unbroken, for the silent reminder of the battle fought and the fragile peace thereafter. Dare to delve deeper into the unknown. Subscribe, like, and comment to join us on more spine-chilling adventures. Your support keeps the fear alive.